Welcome everyone. We will now pause the chat and begin the main event. My name is Anherid Lang and I will be serving as your host today for this live online discussion. As Executive Director of the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, PHAP for short, I am delighted to see such a large turnout for today's important event, including PHAP members as well as many guests. To begin, I would like to offer a quick snapshot of who is here in this large virtual room. More than 600 people have registered for today's event, based in at least 90 different countries, with the most highly represented being at the moment Malaysia, the Philippines, Australia, Thailand, Pakistan, Kenya, Switzerland, the US, and the UK. I will now run through a few brief tips on how to use the online event platform, and then I will introduce our special guest. First, although we have now closed the chat box, we encourage you to continue to pose questions during the event. Please type your questions in the box shown on your screen and click Submit to send them to the host. Written responses will appear in the box above. We will respond here to as many questions as possible, and for those that are not addressed during the event, there will be a follow-up afterwards. Please note that we will also reopen the live chat box following the Q&A, and we will encourage you to continue the discussion there. Second, we are pleased to be able to offer closed captioning for today's discussion in English, as well as simultaneous translation into French. Throughout the event, you will see the English text appear on the bottom left and the French translation appear on the bottom right. For the sake of speed, the simultaneous translation is powered by Google Translate. Therefore, kindly forgive any errors that may result. Now, on behalf of the PHAP membership, it is my honor to introduce and extend a warm welcome to Valerie Amos, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. As you all know, Valerie brings extensive knowledge and experience to her position, having been a longtime campaigner and advocate on human rights, social justice, and equality issues, as well as having served previously as Secretary of State for International Development in the British government and, most recently, the United Kingdom's High Commissioner to Australia, as well as in other relevant positions. We are fortunate to have her with us today to share her vision for the World Humanitarian Summit globally, including what the process aims to achieve and what she hopes to see following the culminating event in Istanbul in 2016, and how the regional consultations fit into that vision. And now, Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon everyone from Singapore. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about the World Humanitarian Summit, which will be held in Istanbul in 2016, and the reason that that summit is so timely. We all know that the scope and scale of humanitarian crises is growing. The impact of conflict, climate change, environmental degradation, population growth, urbanization, and a host of other factors across the world means that there are now more people in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, and the cost of responding to those crises is growing. The cost both in terms of people affected and lives lost, the cost in terms of the impact on humanitarian workers who are doing their very best in some difficult and dangerous circumstances, and also the cost in terms of the financial cost and capacity that is required to respond to those crises. There are a number of different other factors that we also need to address. We are seeing more and more people and organizations engaged in humanitarian response. We are seeing more governments asserting their right and indeed their responsibility to tackle the issues with respect to humanitarian response. We're seeing a greater focus on humanitarian preparedness in terms of response to disasters. but also a recognition that we need to do more to manage risk. In many countries, and I have been very involved in the last 3 years in the crisis in Syria and neighboring countries, we're seeing an increasing attempt to politicize humanitarian action. So how can we address all of these challenges? The Secretary General announced that the first ever World Humanitarian Summit would be held in Istanbul in 2016. And in preparation for that summit, we identified 4 key themes that we thought that we as a global humanitarian community needed to address. The first is how to deal with the issue of people caught in the midst of conflict. The second is how to tackle vulnerability and manage risk. The third, the area of humanitarian aid effectiveness. It's no longer just enough to say that we are saving lives. And fourth, how do we tackle the issue of innovation, and particularly how do we tap into innovative practices, some that are being piloted in many different parts of the world. How can we scale up that innovation? Or indeed, how can we find out about some of the innovation that particularly private sector partners are engaged in? We wanted a fully inclusive and diverse process in the run-up to the summit, not just an intergovernmental process, because we felt that it was extremely important that people affected by disasters, but the broad range of stakeholders currently involved in humanitarian response, our civil society partners, our NGO partners, both at the national and the international level, governments, the private sector, the military, humanitarian agencies across different parts of the world, as well as UN organizations, needed to come together to talk through some difficult issues. We want a transparent process. We want a process which is open and engaging, and we want a process where all of the issues are put on the table. I know that it will be difficult. If we're to have open and honest conversations, it means that we will disagree. But without disagreeing, we will not come to the kinds of conclusions that we need in 2016. We've had the first of 8 regional consultations. The first was held for West and Central Africa in Côte d'Ivoire. The second for this region will be held in Tokyo, hosted by Japan and Indonesia, in about 10 days. The third for Southern Africa will be held in Johannesburg in October. And next year we will see 5 more covering other regions of the world. What is the purpose of those regional consultations? We want to bring together all of the key stakeholders in one room to discuss those 4 themes. Obviously, in each region there will be regional issues, regional dynamics. In this region, for example, the proliferation of natural disasters, but also the existence of conflict, which will be part of the environment, the context in which we discuss those 4 themes. But we want people to be ambitious, to be controversial, to be thinking outside the box, to be creative and innovative in those consultations and in those conversations with us. And those of you that are not able to be physically present at those consultations, we have a World Humanitarian website where we are encouraging everyone to participate, to engage. There will be academic papers posted on the website. There will be people who will just want to come up with an idea and will want to post that online. Please do. This is a truly inclusive process. We want everyone out there with ideas, with comments, indeed with criticism, to come on board and engage with us. What do we see as being the conclusion of this? Well, 2016 will not be the end of the process. What we want are a set of Istanbul principles which will then guide future humanitarian action. We currently have the principles that are fundamental to humanitarian action: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Those principles will always remain at the core and heart of humanitarian action. But what else do we need to think about? How do we work with our development partners? How do we work with the sector? Are there areas of our work that are better served by others doing it rather than big humanitarian organizations? How can we ensure that the people who are the first responders have the capacity and have the knowledge and information that they need that enable them to build their resilience? How can we ensure that local responders, national governments, regional organizations, and then the international community come in that order? And how can we make sure that we are clear about each and every one of us in terms of our roles and responsibilities so that we are not duplicating our practice? These are the issues that I hope we will discuss today, that we will discuss through the regional consultations, we will discuss online in the run-up to the summit. And one last point, if I may. 2015 is a really important year for the humanitarian community. We have the post-Hyogo framework discussions. We also have the end of the process of consultations around the 2015 goals leading to the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to ensure that issues of importance to the humanitarian community are included in those discussions, and that in the Climate Change Summit, which will be held later this year, that some of the crucial issues of concern to us are also included in that discussion. So please engage, think, work with us as we move to what I think will be a successful and inclusive summit in 2016, which will frame the future in terms of global humanitarian action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you for these important opening thoughts. Now, as you know, we have received many important questions from participants as they have registered for this event, and now I can see that more questions are coming in through the online platform as we speak. In particular, I can see that a number of people are asking about the summit process itself, particularly regarding the expected outcomes. So along these lines, I would like to present to you first a specific question coming in from Faisal in Malaysia. Faisal asks, what are some of the tangible outcomes that will hopefully emerge from the WHS in 2016? Or will it be focusing more on intangibles, for example, better understanding especially of the 4 themes, etc.? This is a crucial matter in particular for smaller organizations as we consider investing our precious little resources in the WHS. Valerie?
Thank you very much. And can I say that I absolutely recognize that smaller organizations and individuals will not be able to necessarily devote a huge amount of resources to the consultations in the run-up to the summit. Having said that, we have framed these consultations in a way that I hope means that everyone can engage. That's why we have not only the online platform on which people can input ideas, as well as the regional consultations themselves, but there will be a whole host of national conversations We want to ensure that meetings between now and 2016, where humanitarian issues are being discussed, that summit themes, it doesn't have to be all 4 themes, are discussed through that process. Organizations in their own change and reform processes will be writing papers to think through some of these difficult and challenging issues. Please send us those papers. They don't have to be papers that are 20 pages long. If you have an idea that you've written down on 1 page, please do send it through. And we have a number of people who are helping to support us by working in what we are calling the thematic teams around those 4 themes. And again, any ideas can be fed into that. Now, what kind of outcome are we looking for? First of all, the conversation itself is crucial. Why? Because with so many different actors now in the humanitarian space, we tend to assume that we all share the same values and the same outlook in terms of humanitarian action. I know that we don't. Why do I say that? Because I've been around a lot of countries, I've talked to a lot of organizations, I've talked to governments, and there are some crucial differences between us, and we have to talk through those differences. There are also some stereotypes that we have about each other. There are stereotypes that the military have about humanitarian workers. There are stereotypes that the private sector has. There are stereotypes that we have about each other depending on which part of the world we come from. We need to talk through and address this so we have a shared sense of what the challenge is, but also a shared sense of what some of the outcome should be. So the conversation itself, I think, is crucial. Then there will be tangible and, I hope, intangible results. Tangible results in the sense of a set of key actions that we agree to take as a global humanitarian community going forward from 2016. But also, I think, a set of intangible outcomes in the sense that if we really want to be truly inclusive but also truly diverse, that enabling environment that allows that to happen will be, I hope, one of the intangible outcomes of the consultation processes and the summit itself.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Now, thinking back to your introductory remarks, of course, you mentioned humanitarian principles as the core of what we do. And I see several people now posing questions related to humanitarian principles. And I'd like to bring one to you now. For example, Rebecca in Switzerland is asking, where do you think we are in terms of respect for essential humanitarian principles in the eyes of the humanitarian sector and, importantly, in the eyes of governments? Valerie?
Well, I think that the principles continue to be extremely important as the basis for humanitarian work. And I think that a lot of the humanitarian organizations involved in humanitarian work recognize the importance of the principles. Having said that, I think that as more and more and different actors come into the humanitarian space, so for example, we've had to spend a lot of time working on how civilian and militaries work together in natural disasters, for example, and developing guidelines which respect those principles. I think that as more and more partners come into humanitarian action from different parts of the world and come with different perspectives on what those principles mean, we have to talk it through so that we have a better shared understanding of how we can apply them in different settings. However, there is a big challenge that we now have in conflict situations. I think that there are many governments around the world that are asserting sovereignty and using sovereignty as a basis on which to shrink humanitarian space. We're seeing this in some of the more difficult conflict situations that we're having to face. Syria being the most obvious example right now, but there are many, many others. Governments tend to see one of the core principles that we have to utilize in humanitarian work, which is the ability to talk to anyone. It may be an opposition group, it may be an armed group on the ground. They tend to see the fact that humanitarian workers talk to those groups as in some way conferring legitimacy on those groups. And they don't like it, and they push against it. A lot of my time in the last couple of years has been spent trying to get a much better understanding by governments and people on the political side of why our principles are important and why we need to be able to talk to anyone to get access. So I think that we're, in global terms, as it were, we're at a place where we are having to continue to affirm the centrality of the principles and ensure that the principles are recognized and are being adhered to.
Thank you very much for that. And now, building on the theme that you raised just now, the particularly challenging contexts in which humanitarian work is taking place, and in particular armed conflict situations, we have two related questions coming in now, one from Raya in Syria and the other from Nicole in the United States. First, Raya is asking, what can we do to better protect civilians in besieged areas, and what humanitarian tools do we currently have or do we need to have? And then, as a separate but related question, we have Nicole asking, what are your views on the recent report by the Médecins Sans Frontières that highlights how big aid groups are withdrawing now from emergency work, especially in dangerous conflict zones, in favor of, she says, more lucrative work on faddish concepts, such as, for example, conflict resolution, capacity building, and governance. How would you respond?
Thank you very much. Well, I'd first of all say that if we have civilians who are in besieged areas, at the top of our agenda should be working to ensure that those areas are no longer besieged. I mean, that's the best way in which we can help the people in those communities. And at the moment, we've got 241,000 people in Syria who are in besieged communities, the majority of them in communities besieged by the government, but there are also communities besieged by armed groups inside Syria, and we have been working tirelessly inside Syria, but also outside Syria to try to get those sieges lifted. Where we are not able to get the sieges lifted, a key thing is to try to ensure that the weak, the vulnerable, that if we can negotiate that they can come out. That is not always possible. It has taken months sometimes to negotiate local ceasefires inside Syria. So I think the tools that we have in terms of mediation, negotiation, lobbying, I mean, these are all tools that we have to continue to use, making sure that we keep global visibility on these issues. All of that has to continue. But I have to say that I think the top thing is to try to get those sieges lifted. On the recent report by MSF, I happened to be part of the panel that launched that report in Geneva last week, and it highlights a number of important issues that we need to address with respect to working in conflict situations. And the increasing difficulty that we have working in extremely insecure environments. And of course, with what we have seen with attacks recently on MSF and indeed on ICRC staff in countries across the world, we can see that that independent principle is being undermined. I don't agree with the point that conflict resolution, capacity building and governance are modish concepts. If you talk to people in the Central African Republic where there is no state, no army, no police, no local institutions, they will say to you conflict resolution, capacity building and governance are the things that will make a difference to their day-to-day lives. It's not about doing one and not doing the other. It's about recognizing that if you're working in these extremely complicated environments, there are a range of different ways in which we can work with partners to improve the situation on the ground and make lives better for people.
Thank you, Valerie. And now I'd like to bring together a series of 3 questions that I see coming in, which are linked one to the other. Now, first, building on the summit theme that you mentioned in your opening remarks of transformation through innovation, Chiara from Save the Children is asking, how do you see the potential for humanitarian innovation to shape responses to both slow and fast onset crises? So that's the first. And now, second, as a related question, focusing in particular on the prolonged crises, Guru Roop, who is currently a graduate student in the United States, is asking, as prolonged humanitarian crises become the norm, how can the development and humanitarian communities better coordinate their activities to adequately address the needs of people displaced and affected by crises for prolonged periods of time? And now, third, if I may, without piling on too much here, we have on the coordination thread, Anne in the UK, interested to hear your views on how effective the cluster approach really is. Valerie, back to you.
Thank you very much. In terms of humanitarian innovation, I think that we have seen a huge amount of innovation, particularly in terms of communication systems that we have been able to use. For example, last year when we had Typhoon Haiyan, which helped us to locate people. We've seen what we've been able to do through volunteer mapping. We've been able to see the difference that having decent early warning systems and then ensuring that people in the local community are tapped into those early warning systems. We've seen the difference that that can make. And my interest in terms of having innovation as one of the themes is not just to have innovation for innovation's sake, but to think about what are the major challenges that are going to face us as a humanitarian community in the next year, in the next 5 years. I mean, we're now seeing more cash-based programming, for example, more vouchers. You know, all of this is changing the face of humanitarian response and humanitarian action. But there is so much more that we can do. And every time, you know, I talk to people who are in tech businesses and elsewhere, we've seen the difference that mobile phone technology has made on the African continent, for example. Every time I speak to people in technology-based companies, they are working on systems and practices that are way ahead of anything that we're thinking about. So how we bring the different communities together, we have to be clearer about what is the problem we are seeking to address. Then I think that there are a lot of people out there who can help us to do it. As crises become longer, what more can we do? Well, one example in the area of slow onset crises, for example, and what we have been seeing in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahel region, in the countries across West and Central Africa, is the strategies that the UN with our NGO partners, with donors, but also with the World Bank and others have put together to do a strategic response to food security in those two regions. This is absolutely critical because we know that every couple of years we are likely to see major in food insecurity, sometimes leading to famine, particularly in those two parts of the world. So how we better join up the work that we are doing on the humanitarian side with our colleagues on the development side, work to help communities help themselves in terms of building that resilience. I remember being in Ethiopia and talking to some people who said, look, we used to have major drought every 10 years, then it became every 5, now it's every 2. Our coping capacity, we can't recover enough in a 2-year period to be able to deal with another drought. And that's why linking up what we're doing on the development and the humanitarian side is so critical. And finally, is the cluster approach effective? In some places. It is extremely effective in some places. It depends on the environment in which we are working. In this region that I'm visiting right now, the Philippines, for example, the government has taken on board the cluster approach and integrated it into its own planning. This clearly helps with the work that we're able to do with the government on disaster management. In some other parts of the world, when we're trying to stand up the cluster approach, particularly in situations of complex crisis, it can be much, much more difficult. Some of it also depends on the resources that we have available to invest in coordination. We clearly need to do more to resource coordination so that the cluster approach can be more effective.
Thank you very much. Now, as you know, and you have no doubt seen in the chat before the event, many of our participants today have had first-hand experience of some of the very serious challenges to which the humanitarian sector is attempting to respond, and sometimes may even doubt whether effective response is possible in certain situations. We have a question coming in now from Hazel, who works for Oxfam, who's wondering how can we react when entire regions, the Middle East at present, are unstable and there is nowhere safe for refugees and displaced people to go. Valerie?
Thanks very much. Well, first of all, it's our job. So if we aren't able to react when entire regions are unstable, no one else will be able to do it. You know, part of our core responsibility is to be there and support people in their direst moments. So our advocacy role in terms of ensuring that people who are displaced, but also people who are having to cross borders as refugees, our advocacy role in terms of promoting the interests of those people has to be front and center of our work. But I do also have to say that sometimes even in countries which are extremely unstable, there are parts of those countries where we are able to work. We're seeing that, for example, now in Iraq, where you have parts of the country which are very unstable as a result of what is happening with the movement of ISIS. So people are moving away from those areas and moving into parts of Iraq that are more stable. We have had a history of working in places like Somalia. If you look at the whole of the Middle East, not every single country is unstable. So we have to, first of all, identify the places where people can go. We have to support the governments in those places. We have seen the massive impact that the Syria crisis has had on, I mentioned Iraq just now, but on Jordan, on Lebanon, on Turkey. We need to give those countries the support that they need. We need to give the people in those countries the support that they need as host communities that are being generous in hosting thousands, if not millions, of refugees. We also need to make sure that the services that people need are being provided. We need to, and I know that my colleague Antonio Guterres feels this very strongly, that countries that aren't necessarily in a region but further away need to exercise their responsibilities in terms of opening their borders to refugees. This is sometimes extremely difficult to do. And we need to continue to press our colleagues who work on political issues to do everything that they can to bring peace, security and stability. That, as we know, is hard. It's harder to deliver than it is to say. We saw yesterday the announcement by the Secretary General of the United Nations of the new Special Envoy for Syria. We all wish him well. We have seen the efforts that Secretary of State John Kerry has made to bring about peace in the Middle East, and others have tried too. It's not always successful, but we have to push our colleagues on the political side to keep trying, because without that longer-term peace, security and stability, our work will increase.
Thank you, and thank you for presenting the important challenge, I think, to all of us. Now, humanitarian practitioners are also particularly well placed to observe some of the more specific challenges or possibly even oversights that may be evidence of the need for improvement of certain aspects of the humanitarian system. For example, we have with us today Fiona, who's working for UNHCR, who asks, what are we doing about the existing massive oversight of immediate mental health care in humanitarian emergencies? Valerie?
One of the things that I am very, very conscious of is that there are entire groups of extremely vulnerable people that we are not doing nearly enough for. And with respect to the issue of mental health care, but more generally also the issue of disability, these are areas that are very often invisible in our work. There are some NGO partners that have been very active in terms of pushing us to do more on this, and I've seen some examples of where we have been successful, but it is tiny by comparison to the huge amount of need out there. And I think that one of the challenges that we face, and I hope that the discussions in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit will spotlight this, is that dealing with people with particular vulnerabilities is something which we have to do more as a community to tackle. For a very long time, you know, our focus, by making this statement, I'm in no way trying to undermine what we do, but our focus has been about saving lives. And of course, saving lives is extremely important. But if we don't look after people's mental health as well, I've seen the trauma caused to children who have witnessed the most horrific acts, for example. If we don't deal with that, then we are actually condemning people to a terrible future. So this is something that we have to do better at.
Thank you. And turning now to the topic of gender, we have a question coming in from Line from the Norwegian Red Cross, and she points out that integration of gender issues are still a long way to go in humanitarian interventions, and she asks, has the gender agenda actually failed? How do you see that humanitarian actors can become better in integrating gender sensitivities?
I don't think it's failed, but I think that we have to recognize that it is something that we have to keep pushing. I think that we have to do mainstreaming and integration, but we also have to continue to ensure that we raise the challenges of gender issues. Why do I say that? I've been working on gender issues for practically all of my working life. And what I've noticed is that the minute that we think we have a success and we can stop talking about it, we slip back. So we have to keep focused on these issues. I've been very pleased to see this year, for example, the way that women supported by men in many countries have come out and raised their voices against what has been happening in terms of sexual violence in their countries. We saw the big summit which was held as well in London recently, which focused on these issues, and over 100 countries were represented at that summit. But more importantly, in my view, those who had suffered abuse and had been victims of violence were there speaking about, not only about their experiences, but about what needed to be done to keep these issues on the global agenda. So I think we have a responsibility to keep talking about the impunity that we have seen with respect to these issues around the world. I think that we have to challenge the kind of cultural relativism that we see with respect to issues like child marriage, for example. All of these things we have to keep high on the agenda, because over many years, what I am still shocked at and continue to be shocked at is particularly the way that women are viewed in so many societies around the world. And this is not about, rich or poor countries. It's not about, the majority religion in those countries. If you just scratch below the surface in the majority of countries around the world, you cannot in any way talk about women's equality, not just in terms of economic equality, but particularly in terms of the way that women are viewed and perceived in those societies. And this is something that we are going to have to continue to challenge day in, day out.
Excellent, thank you. And now, coming back to, I guess, the big picture of the discussion today and of the World Humanitarian Summit process as a whole, looking at some of the fundamental questions that the summit process gives us the opportunity to ask. We have a participant, Megha in India, who's asking, how is the humanitarian community tackling conflicts around the world, such as the Syria crisis, the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, Philippines, South Sudan, and Afghanistan? Is the United Nations as an international community actually enough to deal with the endless crises in the world, or should it urge the country's governments to step up and tackle the conflicts. And I guess I would add to this a related question that we've received that's perhaps put more bluntly from a participant coming in from Spain who asks, until when are we humanitarians going to have to clean up after the messes created by politicians? Valerie, how would you respond?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the UN on its own can solve any of these crises. It has to be a shared goal of governments, of the UN, of the people in those countries, the countries with influence, to seek to bring those conflicts to an end. And we all know that countries have national interests, and that those interests are reflected in the way that they work in the international fora. So part of what we have to do in terms of our humanitarian work is to ensure that countries understand what the impact of the decisions that they take in their national interest might be in terms of longer-term humanitarian work. And I've seen, one part of a government that is doing one thing in terms of humanitarian support and development support to a country, and the political side of the government may have a different view. They're not joined up, and we see that sometimes replicated across a number of different countries. So the humanitarian response is just one aspect very often, especially if we're dealing with conflict situations that have gone on for a very, very long time. And I also think that sometimes the failure to do longer-term strategic thinking, to really look at what is happening in a region. There are so many areas now where we're not just talking about a single country, we are talking about the regional impact of a crisis which has spread across borders, not just in terms of refugees, but more generally in terms of security and the broader impact on people. And as humanitarian workers, yes, part of our job is to go and support people in need, but I think we have to continually put the onus back on our colleagues working on political issues and on governments to do the best that they can to bring about peace. But there's one other thing. You can sign a peace agreement, but the support that is required to a country or to the different groups on the ground who have signed that agreement doesn't stop there. A lot of the work starts at that point. And if you look at many of the countries where we've had prolonged crises, what you see is there's been a lot of international support up until the point when a peace treaty is signed, and then a lot of the international community disappears. We have to recognize that the transformation of a state, a post-conflict state, a fragile state, takes a very long time, and that we as an international community have got to give that support over 15 or 20 years. It's not 5, it's not 10, it's a much longer process than that, and we as humanitarian workers should not be picking up the pieces over that time. Colleagues working on development issues, on longer term stabilization, this is where a lot of the focus has got to be.
Thank you once again. And of course, there are many excellent questions and comments still coming in, but we are approaching the end of our time for today. As mentioned, we will ensure that all of the questions are followed up in the coming days, and we also encourage everyone in the event now to stay here online and participate in the live chat after we close the audio conference. But before we draw today's event to a close, I would like to ask Valerie if you would like to share some closing remarks.
Well, first of all, I'd like to really thank everyone who has participated and who has put in questions. I think the questions very much demonstrate the huge amount of interest there is in these issues and a huge amount of commitment to trying to work through how we can address them. I would just like to repeat what I said at the beginning. Please do stay engaged and involved. We want to hear from all of you. We want to have the difficult conversations. This is not just for us. This is about the millions of people across the world who are depending on our work. I'm always amazed when I go out there to the field. I'm amazed at the kind of work that humanitarian workers are prepared to do day in, day out, putting their lives on the line. But I'm even more amazed at the resilience that I find of people who have little or nothing. We are their advocates. We are their champions. And let us continue to be that until such time as they are able to raise their own voices because the conflict has stopped, or because we have been able to do enough to help them to restore their livelihoods and communities. So thank you all very much indeed for your participation, and please do continue to stay engaged.
And thank you very much, Valerie. I am confident that I share the sentiment of this entire virtual room, as I warmly thank you for your time and your insights today, for sharing your own vision for the World Humanitarian Summit, and for helping to ensure that the questions and the concerns of humanitarian practitioners, as well as other stakeholders from all over the world, are heard and addressed. And now, as we move into our closing slides, I'd like to point out a couple of upcoming opportunities for further discussion related to the World Humanitarian Summit. The next opportunity coming up this next coming Wednesday, 16th July, when we will be looking in depth at the outcomes from the West and Central Africa regional consultations. And I would note for everyone that this event on 16 July will be conducted in French. Then the following opportunity is a very exciting announcement to make today, that PHAP will be facilitating live streaming and simultaneous online discussion during the upcoming North and Southeast Asia consultations, which will be taking place in Tokyo on the 23rd and 24th of July. My colleagues have posted some information on the screen, but additional information will be circulated by email and is available on our website. Now, in closing, I would like to also thank the entire staff here at PHAP, of course the Summit team sitting in New York, and the OCHA Regional Office in Bangkok for all of their efforts these last couple of weeks to make today's event possible. I would also like to thank our friends at ReliefWeb, Iran, at Asian NGO, ALNAP, the Sphere Project, Fordham University, and so many other individuals and organizations for helping to spread the word about today's event. And for more information about the World Humanitarian Summit, and of course to join the online consultations, we strongly encourage you and invite you to visit www.worldhumanitariansummit.org, and also to discuss on Twitter using the hashtag WHSummit. I would also invite you to learn more about the professional association PHAP by visiting our website at www.phap.org. Thank you all once again for being here today, and I look forward to our next special event together. In the meantime, this is Anne Herod Lang and the whole PHAP team signing off from